October 25, 1942. The Matanikau River, Guadalcanal. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell Paige crouched behind a weapon the Marine Corps considered a relic. The M1917 Browning water-cooled machine gun weighed 103 pounds fully assembled, its massive cooling jacket gleaming dully in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, newer M1919 air-cooled models sat in defensive positions, lighter by 60 pounds, faster by 400 rounds per minute. Modern warfare, the manuals insisted, demanded mobility and speed. But as 800 Japanese voices erupted from the jungle in a coordinated Banzai charge, something impossible began to happen. The sleek M1919s opened fire first, their barrels glowing cherry red within 90 seconds as the humid tropical air failed to dissipate the heat building inside their mechanisms. One by one, they fell silent, their crews frantically signaling for barrel changes, while the enemy surged forward through the gaps in defensive fire. Meanwhile, Paige's ancient M1917 settled into its rhythm. 600 rounds per minute, steady as a heartbeat, the water jacket absorbing heat and converting it to steam that hissed softly into the night. The gun that military planners wanted to retire was about to teach the Marine Corps its most important lesson about jungle warfare. The afternoon heat pressed down on Henderson Field like a physical weight as Captain Robert Blake stood at the edge of the airstrip, watching his Marines wrestle equipment into defensive positions. 3 months into the Guadalcanal campaign, and every decision felt like a gamble against incomplete intelligence and inadequate supplies. The M1917 Brownings squatted in their sandbagged emplacements like iron monuments to a previous war, each gun demanding a 3-man crew just to move it into position. Blake had spent the past week arguing with division headquarters about the weapon assignments. The M1919 represented everything modern military, doctrine valued: portability, rapid deployment, ease of maintenance. At 41 pounds, a single Marine could carry it. The air cooling system eliminated the complex plumbing required by water jackets. The cyclic rate approached 1,000 rounds per minute in sustained bursts, nearly double the M1917's plodding 600. Every tactical manual emphasized mobile warfare, rapid advances, flexibility in deployment. The heavy water-cooled guns seemed to contradict everything the Pacific Theater demanded. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Private First Class Jimmy Reeves struggled with the tripod mount of his assigned M1917, the metal legs catching in coral sand as he tried to adjust the traverse. The weapon's bulk frustrated him after months of training with the sleek M1 Garand rifle. Everything about the machine gun felt excessive. The gallon of water, sloshing in the cooling jacket, the ammunition belts that required 2 men to carry, the complex headspace and timing adjustments that consumed precious minutes during setup. His squad mate, Corporal Eddie Santos, shared the skepticism as they linked ammunition belts together in preparation for the night's defensive watch. The technical specifications told a story that seemed definitive. The M1919 Browning, adopted in 1934, fired the same .30-06 cartridge as its predecessor, but did so with modern efficiency. The air-cooled barrel could sustain firing rates approaching 1,000 rounds per minute in short bursts, provided crews allowed brief cooling periods between sustained sequences. The weapon weighed 41 pounds complete with tripod, making it genuinely portable for rapid repositioning. Doctrine emphasized the advantages. Lighter weight meant faster deployment. Air cooling eliminated maintenance complications. Higher cyclic rates provided superior firepower density. The development history of both weapons revealed fundamentally different design philosophies. John Moses Browning had designed the M1917 during the First World War with a singular focus: sustained fire capability for static defensive positions. The water jacket wasn't an afterthought or a compromise, it was the central feature around which the entire weapon was engineered. Browning understood that trench warfare demanded machine guns capable of firing thousands of rounds without pause, creating barriers of lead that enemy infantry couldn't penetrate. The cooling system he developed could absorb approximately 400 British thermal units per minute during sustained fire, far exceeding any air-cooled design's capabilities. The M1917's development reflected different priorities shaped by interwar military thinking. Planners had studied the Great War and concluded that future conflicts would emphasize mobility and maneuver warfare rather than static trench fighting. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and subsequent arms limitation agreements had shifted military focus toward expeditionary operations in colonial territories, where portability mattered more than sustained defensive fire. The M1919 was optimized for these scenarios, light enough for infantry to carry during advances, simple enough to maintain with minimal logistics, fast enough to deliver devastating bursts during brief engagements. Reeves had grown up hearing stories about the Great War from his uncle, who'd served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. The older man had described M1917s as the guns that won the war, weapons that could fire all day without stopping while German troops threw themselves against American positions. But that was a different war, fought in muddy trenches across static front lines. The Pacific demanded speed, flexibility, adaptation to terrain that changed from beach to jungle to mountain within miles. The young private couldn't reconcile his uncle's reverence for the old guns with the tactical realities he'd learned during training. Santos, more experienced than Reeves, had a different perspective shaped by combat on Tulagi 3 months earlier. He'd watched M1919 crews struggle during a Japanese night attack, their weapons falling silent at critical moments while gunners frantically changed barrels. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, but in that brief window, the thermal limitations of air-cooled weapons had created gaps that nearly proved fatal. Santos hadn't articulated his concerns to anyone, partly because he lacked the technical vocabulary and partly because questioning official doctrine seemed pointless. But he'd volunteered for the M1917 crew when positions were being assigned, trusting instincts developed through survival rather than tactical manuals. Blake walked the defensive perimeter, observing his gunners prepare positions according to standard procedure. Marines had dug shallow pits for the machine guns, creating fields of fire that overlapped across the approaches to Henderson Field. Japanese forces had demonstrated remarkable skill at nighttime infiltration, using jungle cover to close distance before American sentries could react. The tactical solution seemed obvious. Maximize firepower through rapid-firing weapons that could deliver devastating volumes of lead during brief engagement windows. The defensive preparations revealed stark differences in how the two weapon types affected tactical planning. M1919 positions could be relocated relatively quickly if the tactical situation changed. A two-man team could break down the gun, move 50 yards, and re-establish firing position within 3 to 4 minutes. This mobility allowed commanders to adjust defensive alignments based on enemy probing attacks or changing intelligence. The lighter weapon encouraged aggressive tactics, with crews trained to displace forward during enemy withdrawals or shift laterally to support adjacent units under pressure. M1917 positions, by contrast, represented significant investments of time and labor. Moving one of the heavy guns required a 3-man team working for at least 10 minutes, accounting for the weapon's weight and the need to transport water supplies separately. Once emplaced, the gun became the anchor around which other defensive elements were positioned. This influenced everything from fields of fire to ammunition distribution to communication wire routing. The immobility that seemed like a weakness actually created tactical clarity. These positions would hold, or the entire defensive line would collapse. Paige had spent 3 days preparing his fighting position with meticulous attention to detail that bordered on obsession. He'd measured ranges to key terrain features using a surveyor's tape borrowed from the combat engineers, recording distances in a waterproof notebook that lived in his breast pocket. The notebook contained diagrams showing dead space, where terrain masked targets, optimal firing azimuths for different enemy approach routes, and calculations of ammunition required for various engagement scenarios. His assistant gunner Miller had initially thought this level of preparation excessive, but had come to appreciate how the advance work eliminated decision-making during combat's chaos. The range cards Paige created went far beyond standard doctrine. He'd identified specific trees, rock outcroppings, and terrain features at 25-yard intervals from 50 to 400 yards, assigning each a designation that allowed rapid target indication. Oak 50, Boulder 100, Fallen Log 225. During darkness, when visual acquisition became impossible, these reference points would allow him to engage targets based purely on sound, using muzzle flashes or movement noise to estimate enemy positions relative to known landmarks. The technique required intimate familiarity with the terrain, knowledge that could only be gained through days of patient observation. The ammunition preparation alone consumed an entire afternoon. Paige inspected every cartridge in every belt, looking for signs of corrosion, verdigris on brass cases, or damage to projectile tips that might cause feeding failures. He rejected approximately 3% of the issued ammunition, setting aside suspect rounds for disposal rather than risk a malfunction during combat. The belts were then arranged in specific patterns, tracer rounds every fifth position to allow observation of beaten zones during darkness, with concentration of tracers at belt ends to signal impending requirement for reload. Water management for the cooling system required equal attention. Paige had established a supply point 15 yards behind his position, where 5-gallon containers held water drawn from a nearby stream and treated with purification tablets. The stream water contained sediment that could clog the cooling system's narrow passages, so he'd improvised a filtration system using cloth torn from spare uniforms. Miller had tested the water circulation by running it through the jacket without firing, checking for leaks or blockages that might cause failures during sustained fire. The psychological preparation proved equally important. Paige gathered his crew each evening to review procedures, walking through ammunition changes, water replenishment, and malfunction drills until the sequences became automatic. He emphasized that their weapon represented the defensive position's foundation. If they failed, adjacent positions would be outflanked and the entire line compromised. The responsibility was enormous, but Paige presented it matter-of-factly, without dramatics or false bravado. Their job was to keep the gun firing regardless of what happened around them. Everything else was secondary. Blake's evening briefing to his platoon commanders reflected his own uncertainty about the pending engagement. Intelligence estimates suggested Japanese strength in the sector at battalion level or higher, possibly reinforced by artillery and armor that had been infiltrated during previous nights. The defensive positions were adequate for repelling company-sized attacks, but a coordinated regimental assault might overwhelm them through sheer numerical advantage. The machine guns represented their primary killing mechanism, the weapon system that would determine whether they held or were overrun. Yet something about the M1917's design continued to nag at Blake as he watched Sergeant Paige methodically check his weapon's water circulation system. The massive cooling jacket wasn't just dead weight. It represented a fundamentally different approach to sustained fire. Where the M1919 relied on atmospheric convection to dissipate barrel heat, the water-cooled system actively absorbed thermal energy through direct contact with the barrel. The liquid coolant could absorb approximately 1 calorie of heat energy per gram per degree Celsius, far exceeding air's cooling capacity. The Pacific environment created conditions no peacetime testing had adequately simulated. Guadalcanal's average temperature hovered around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity consistently above 90%. At these extremes, air cooling became progressively less effective as the temperature differential between hot metal and ambient atmosphere decreased. The M1919's reliance on convective heat transfer meant that tropical conditions directly reduced its sustained fire capability. Blake had observed this phenomenon during a training exercise conducted 2 weeks prior to the current deployment. His gunners had practiced sustained fire drills, simulating the defensive barrage required against human wave attacks. The M1919S performed impressively for approximately 2 minutes, their higher cyclic rates chewing through ammunition with satisfying speed. Then, problems emerged. The air-cooled barrels began to glow, first dull red, then brighter as metal temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Gunners were forced to cease fire, waiting 3 to 5 minutes for barrels to cool sufficiently to resume operation. Meanwhile, Paige's M1917 had maintained its steady 600 rounds per minute without interruption. The water jacket absorbed heat continuously, converting thermal energy to steam that vented through a simple escape valve. By the exercise's conclusion, the older weapon had actually fired more total rounds, despite its lower cyclic rate, never forced into silence by thermal limitations. The newer guns had delivered impressive bursts, but couldn't sustain the prolonged engagement that jungle defense required. The ammunition feeding systems also revealed subtle but significant differences. Both weapons used disintegrating link belts, but the M1917 accommodated continuous belts that could be linked together for extended firing sequences. Paige had prepared ammunition belts exceeding 250 rounds, reducing reload frequency during critical moments. The M1919 typically used shorter belt lengths that required more frequent changes, creating brief but potentially fatal gaps in covering fire. Reeves continued his preparation with typical Marine efficiency, but Blake could sense the doubt radiating from his younger Marines. Every other unit in the Pacific seemed to be transitioning toward lighter, more modern equipment. Only here, defending this crucial airstrip in the middle of nowhere, were they stuck with guns that belonged in museums. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same weapons that had helped win the Great War were now viewed as obsolete, unsuited for mobile Pacific warfare. Yet as Blake completed his inspection and returned to his command post, he found himself reconsidering assumptions he'd held since officer training. The M1917's weight and complexity weren't design flaws. They were deliberate engineering choices that prioritized sustained fire capability over portability. In static defensive positions, where guns wouldn't be moved frequently, those choices might prove more valuable than the mobility advantages offered by lighter weapons. Within 18 hours, combat would provide the definitive answer to questions that training exercises could only approximate. The jungle breathed with menacing stillness as darkness settled over the Matanikau River valley. Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines had established defensive positions along a ridgeline that commanded approaches to Henderson Field. The Japanese had been probing these defenses for 3 days, testing American reactions and mapping defensive strengths. Intelligence reports suggested a major assault was imminent, but the timing and scale remained uncertain. Sergeant Paige checked his M1917's water level for the 3rd time that evening, ensuring the cooling jacket was filled to capacity. His assistant gunner, Private Harry Miller, had prepared ammunition in precisely measured quantities. 8 belts of 250 rounds each, carefully inspected for damaged cartridges or defective links. The preparation ritual helped calm nerves while the jungle's nocturnal sounds masked any indication of enemy movement. The assault began at 0300 hours, with a sound that raised every hair on Paige's neck. 800 voices screaming in unified fury as Japanese soldiers of the 4th Infantry Regiment poured from the tree line. They came in coordinated waves, bayonets fixed, faces twisted with the fanatical determination that had broken American lines across the Pacific. The first rank charged through shallow river water while others pressed behind them, a human avalanche that seemed unstoppable in the moonlight. Captain Blake's M1919 positions opened fire immediately, their weapons chattering at nearly 1,000 rounds per minute, as gunners poured lead into the charging mass. The effect was initially devastating. Bodies crumpled and fell, the high-velocity 30-06 rounds tearing through flesh and bone with terrible efficiency. For 90 seconds, the newer guns seemed to justify every tactical manual ever written about rapid defensive fire. Then thermal reality asserted itself. The first M1917 fell silent as its barrel reached critical temperature, glowing visibly in the darkness. The gunner frantically signaled for a barrel change, a procedure that required approximately 45 seconds even under ideal conditions. Another gun fell silent 30 seconds later, then a third, their mechanisms literally seizing as thermal expansion locked moving parts together. The gaps in defensive fire allowed the Japanese charge to gain momentum, closing distance that should have remained an impenetrable killing zone. The barrel change procedure that seemed straightforward during training became nightmarishly complex under combat conditions. The gunner had to remove the hot barrel using asbestos gloves, a process that involved releasing the barrel locking mechanism while the weapon was still partially disassembled. The replacement barrel, pre-positioned nearby, had to be installed with precise alignment to ensure proper headspace, the critical distance between the bolt face and the cartridge base. Incorrect headspace could cause catastrophic weapon failure, potentially killing the crew. Finally, the gunner had to perform timing adjustments to synchronize the bolt's rearward movement with the ammunition belt's feed cycle. During peacetime training, experienced crews could complete this sequence in 30 to 35 seconds. Under combat stress, with enemy forces advancing and friendly casualties mounting, the time stretched to 45 seconds or longer. Each second represented approximately 15 yards of ground that charging enemy infantry could cover, translating directly into reduced defensive depth. Multiple weapons experiencing simultaneous barrel changes created overlapping gaps that skilled attackers could exploit, penetrating defensive lines that should have been impregnable. Corporal Danny Morrison's M1917 position, located 40 yards left of Paige's emplacement, illustrated the cascading failures that thermal limitations created. Morrison was a veteran gunner who'd trained on the M1919 for 18 months, achieving expert qualification scores and instructor certification. His crew had prepared meticulously, with 4 spare barrels positioned for rapid access and ammunition stacked for efficient feeding. By conventional standards, they represented an ideal machine gun team. Morrison's weapon fired its first burst at 0302 hours, precisely timed with the initial Japanese emergence from the tree line. The gun performed flawlessly for 80 seconds, its 1,000 round per minute cyclic rate producing a devastating volume of fire that dropped approximately 20 enemy soldiers in the initial engagement. Morrison felt confident, almost euphoric, as he watched his beaten zone fill with casualties. The weapon was performing exactly as doctrine predicted. At 0303 hours and 20 seconds, Morrison noticed the barrel's color changing from dark metal to dull red. The temperature indicator, a heat-sensitive paint stripe applied during armory preparation, showed dangerous thermal buildup. He continued firing for another 10 seconds, reluctant to cease during the critical initial contact phase, then signaled his assistant gunner for a barrel change. The procedure began at 0303 hours and 30 seconds. During those 48 seconds required to complete the barrel change, approximately 60 Japanese soldiers advanced an additional 120 yards, closing from 300 yards to 180 yards distance. More critically, the gap in Morrison's covering, fire allowed enemy troops to shift laterally, seeking defilade behind terrain features that previous fire had forced them to avoid. When Morrison's weapon resumed firing at 0304 hours and 18 seconds, the tactical geometry had changed significantly. Enemy forces that should have been pinned in the open were now advancing using cover, complicating target acquisition and reducing the effectiveness of his subsequent fire. Morrison's gun fired for another 90 seconds before requiring a second barrel change at 0305 hours and 48 seconds. The pattern repeated throughout the engagement, impressive fire rates separated by cooling periods that created tactical opportunities for the attackers. By 0330 hours, Morrison had changed barrels 4 times and was experiencing feeding malfunctions caused by heat distortion of the weapon's receiver. His gun contributed significantly to the defensive fire, but couldn't provide the sustained coverage that the tactical situation demanded. Adjacent M1919 positions experienced similar thermal limitations, though timing varied based on each gun's individual firing patterns. The staggered cooling requirements created a patchwork of covering fire rather than the continuous wall of lead that defensive doctrine envisioned. Japanese assault troops, well trained in exploiting firepower gaps, adjusted their advance to take advantage of these cyclical vulnerabilities. Paige's M1917 had been firing continuously since the engagement began. 600 rounds per minute, precisely timed, each burst carefully aimed into predetermined sectors that he'd marked during daylight reconnaissance. The water jacket absorbed barrel heat through direct metal to liquid contact, converting thermal energy into steam at 100 degrees Celsius. The vapor vented safely through a simple release valve, maintaining consistent barrel temperature regardless of firing duration. Blake watched from his command position as the tactical situation developed exactly opposite to his expectations. The modern weapons, designed for mobile warfare and rapid deployment, were failing during sustained defensive engagement. The ancient water-cooled gun was performing its designed mission flawlessly, maintaining the continuous fire that static defense required. The weapon's weight, its complexity, its seemingly obsolete cooling system, all revealed themselves as engineering solutions to problems the M1919's designers had chosen to ignore. The Japanese pressed their attack with suicidal determination. Those who fell were simply trampled by others pushing forward from behind. Some carried explosive charges strapped to their bodies, willing to die if they could reach American positions. The coordinated assault had been planned to exploit exactly the kind of firepower gaps that the M1919s were now creating through their thermal limitations. Paige fed belt after belt into his weapon's receiver, his movements smooth with practiced efficiency despite the chaos erupting around him. 2,000 rounds passed through the gun's chamber without a single mechanical failure. The water jacket's temperature rose steadily, but remained well below the boiling point that would compromise cooling efficiency. Steam rose from the ventilation ports like incense from some mechanical altar, but the gun's mechanism remained cool and precise. Corporal Santos, working as Paige's assistant gunner, maintained ammunition supply while monitoring the water level through a sight glass mounted on the cooling jacket. The system consumed approximately 1 quart of water per hour during sustained firing, a manageable rate that posed no operational limitations. Santos had prepared reserve water supplies drawn from the Matanikau River, ensuring the gun could maintain fire indefinitely. The M1919 crews struggled back into action as they completed hurried barrel changes. The procedure required removing the hot barrel using asbestos gloves, installing a replacement, and performing headspace and timing adjustments to ensure proper function. Under combat stress, with enemy forces pressing forward and ammunition expenditure critical, these procedures consumed precious seconds that translated directly into casualties. The interrupted fire had allowed Japanese soldiers to penetrate the outer defensive wire, creating breaches that threatened to collapse the entire position. Blake found himself mesmerized by the M1917's relentless performance. Each firing sequence lasted precisely the same duration. Each pause for belt changes consumed exactly the same interval. Each correction of fire followed the same deliberate process. The weapon had become an extension of Paige's will, responsive to minute adjustments, yet independent of human limitations like fatigue or heat buildup. The Japanese charge faltered as bodies accumulated in the killing zone. Survivors found themselves trapped between the river, behind them, and the unceasing fire from Paige's position ahead. Some attempted flanking maneuvers along the riverbank, but Paige simply traversed the gun, left and right, his pre-marked reference points, allowing accurate fire even in complete darkness. The water-cooled system's sustained capability created a defensive barrier that human courage couldn't overcome. By dawn, the Matanikau River crossing was carpeted with approximately 750 Japanese casualties. The 4th Infantry Regiment, once considered among the Imperial Army's finest units, had been effectively destroyed in a single engagement. Paige's M1917 sat silent at last, its water jacket warm, but its mechanism ready for immediate resumption if required. Around it, the newer M1919S showed clear evidence of their thermal ordeal. Barrels discolored by extreme heat, some permanently warped beyond repair. Blake walked among his gun crews as they cleaned weapons and assessed ammunition expenditure. The statistics told a story that no training manual had prepared him to interpret. Paige's M1917 had fired over 4,000 rounds during the 6-hour engagement without a single mechanical failure. Its water-cooled system had maintained consistent performance throughout, the barrel temperature never exceeding safe operational limits. The M1919S had fired fewer total rounds despite their higher cyclic rate, forced into repeated silence by overheating that created critical vulnerabilities in defensive coverage. The detailed ammunition accounting revealed extraordinary disparities in actual firepower delivered. Paige's position had expended 4,350 rounds, from 0-300 hours to 0-900 hours, an average of 725 rounds per hour, or 12 rounds per minute when accounting for reload and observation periods. The sustained fire capability had allowed him to maintain continuous pressure on enemy forces throughout the entire engagement without thermal interruptions. Morrison's M1919 position, by comparison, had expended 3,200 rounds during the same 6-hour period, an average of 533 rounds per hour. However, the actual firing time totaled approximately 2 hours and 45 minutes, with the remainder consumed by 4 barrel changes and multiple cooling periods required when thermal indicators showed dangerous heat buildup. During active firing, Morrison's gun had achieved approximately 1,100 rounds per hour, significantly exceeding Paige's rate. But the interruptions had reduced total effectiveness by nearly 40%. The mathematics became more stark when analyzing rounds delivered per minute of enemy contact. Japanese assault troops were actively advancing for approximately 35 of the engagement's 360 minutes, with the remainder devoted to consolidation, casualty evacuation, and preparation for subsequent assault waves. During these 35 minutes of active contact, Paige's M1917 had fired approximately 2,100 rounds, an average of 60 rounds per minute. Morrison's position had fired approximately 1,400 rounds during the same critical period's 40 rounds per minute. The 20-round per minute differential translated directly into enemy casualties and defensive effectiveness. Blake's analysis extended beyond simple round counts to examine the tactical effects of continuous versus interrupted fire. Paige's sustained fire had created a beaten zone, the area where bullets impacted the ground that remained consistently lethal throughout the engagement. Japanese troops learned quickly that approaching his position meant certain death, forcing them to concentrate their assault on other sectors. This channeling effect multiplied the M1917's effectiveness by directing enemy forces into killing zones covered by multiple weapons. Morrison's position, despite the gunner's exceptional skill, had created a beaten zone that alternated between lethal and passable based on the weapon's thermal status. Japanese assault troops had learned to time their advances during the gaps created by barrel changes, rushing forward during the 40 to 50-second windows when the gun was silent. This tactical adaptation had allowed enemy forces to close distance that should have been impassable, ultimately requiring Morrison's position to be reinforced by infantry with rifles and grenades. The casualty analysis provided the most damning evidence of thermal limitations' tactical cost. Approximately 280 Japanese soldiers had been killed in the sector covered by Paige's M1917, compared to 140 in Morrison's M1919 sector. Despite both positions having similar fields of fire and enemy exposure, the 2-to-1 casualty ratio directly reflected the difference between continuous and interrupted fire. More significantly, Morrison's sector had experienced 3 near penetrations where Japanese troops had reached within grenade range of American positions, forcing desperate close-quarters fighting that resulted in 4 Marine casualties. Paige's sector had experienced 0 near penetrations and 0 friendly casualties. The mechanical reliability statistics reinforced the performance differential. Paige's M1917 had experienced 0 malfunctions during 4,350 rounds fired. The weapon's only maintenance requirement had been periodic water replenishment. Miller had added approximately 3 quarts to the cooling jacket during the engagement, a straightforward procedure that consumed less than 30 seconds and required no ceasefire. The gun's mechanism had functioned flawlessly throughout, with no parts breakage, no feeding failures, no extraction problems. Morrison's M1919 had experienced 4 barrel changes, each requiring weapons to be completely first, non-functional for 40 to 50 seconds plus 2 additional malfunctions requiring remedial action. The first malfunction, occurring at approximately 04:15 hours, involved a failure to extract where a spent cartridge case remained stuck in the chamber. Morrison had cleared this using the manual extraction procedure, consuming approximately 25 seconds. The second malfunction, at approximately 06:45 hours, involved a failure to feed caused by heat distortion of the receiver rails that guided the ammunition belt. Morrison had corrected this by allowing extended cooling time approximately 3 minutes before resuming fire. The water consumption data for Paige's M1917 provided insights into the cooling system's efficiency under combat conditions. The weapon had consumed approximately 1 gallon of water during 6 hours of sustained fire, averaging slightly less than 3 cups per hour. The cooling jacket's initial water load, approximately 1 gallon, had been sufficient for the first 3 hours of engagement. Miller had replenished the jacket twice during the battle, adding 2 quarts at approximately 0600 hours and another 2 quarts at approximately 0730 hours. The steam generation rate had varied based on firing intensity. During peak engagement periods, when Paige was maintaining sustained fire at full cyclic rate, steam vented continuously from the cooling jacket's release valve, creating visible clouds that could have compromised position security under different tactical conditions. During lulls in enemy activity, steam generation decreased proportionally, with the water temperature dropping back toward ambient conditions. The self-regulating nature of the system meant that the gun automatically adapted its cooling performance to match actual thermal load. The tactical implications were staggering and undeniable. In tropical environments where humidity and ambient temperature were constant factors, the older weapon's cooling system provided decisive advantages that modern air-cooled technology couldn't match. The M1919's design worked perfectly in temperate climates, but struggled catastrophically in the South Pacific's oppressive conditions. Weight and complexity, the factors that had made the M1917 seem obsolete, had proven to be essential features when missions demanded sustained firepower over extended periods. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Paige emerged from his fighting position like a man awakening from a trance, his uniform soaked with sweat and condensation from the gun's steam vents. He had spent 6 hours feeding ammunition belts, making minute adjustments to maintain accuracy as targets shifted. The weapon had become part of him, its rhythm matching his breathing, its needs anticipated before they arose. His hands showed burns from contact with hot metal, but his face displayed the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who'd performed his trade perfectly under maximum stress. As sunlight revealed the full scope of their victory, Blake felt his skepticism dissolving into something approaching reverence. The museum piece had proven its worth in the most demanding test imaginable, outlasting and outperforming its modern replacement when survival depended on sustained firepower. The jungle had revealed a truth that peacetime planning had completely missed. Sometimes the oldest solution was definitively the best one, validated not by specifications on paper, but by performance under fire. The transformation of tactical doctrine began within hours of the Matanikau engagement as word spread through Marine Corps channels like wildfire. Blake found himself summoned to division headquarters, where Major General Alexander Vandergrift waited with a stack of after-action reports and questions that would fundamentally reshape Pacific theater machine gun employment. Vandergrift's weathered face showed the accumulated strain of defending Guadalcanal against relentless Japanese assault, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had kept Marines alive through months of desperate fighting. He spread engagement reports across his makeshift desk, pointing to ammunition expenditure figures that told an extraordinary story. The M1917 positions had maintained continuous fire for over 6 hours, consuming more than 20,000 rounds without experiencing a single weapon failure. Meanwhile, positions equipped with M1919S had suffered multiple barrel changes and extended cooling periods that created dangerous gaps in defensive coverage. The newer guns had fired impressive bursts when functioning, but couldn't sustain the prolonged engagement that jungle warfare consistently demanded. Vandergrift traced casualty figures with his finger, noting how enemy dead clustered heaviest in front of the water-cooled positions. The M1917's steady 600 rounds per minute had created killing zones that remained consistently lethal throughout the engagement, while the M1919's higher cyclic rate proved meaningless when thermal limitations forced repeated ceasefires during critical moments. Within 48 hours, urgent communications flowed to Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico, requesting immediate redistribution of M1917 machine guns to frontline units across the Pacific. The weapon that had been relegated to training roles and rear area security suddenly became the most requested item in the entire supply chain. Ordnance officers scrambled to locate stored weapons and ship them forward, while armourers worked around the clock to refurbish guns that had been gathering dust in stateside warehouses. The supply challenge proved more complex than simple logistics. Many M1917s had been in storage since 1919, when the Great War's armistice had ended their primary combat role. 23 years of warehousing had taken its toll on weapons that required precise machining tolerances and proper preservation. Ordnance depots across the continental United States received urgent orders to inventory their M1917 stocks and report serviceable quantities. The results were discouraging. Approximately 40% of stored weapons showed significant corrosion, damaged water jackets, or missing components that rendered them unserviceable without major refurbishment. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, Chief Armourer at the Marine Corps Depot of Supplies in Philadelphia, found himself at the center of the refurbishment effort. His facility housed approximately 800 M1917s that had been mothballed since the early 1920s. Kowalski's initial inspection revealed the scope of restoration required. Water jackets showing pinhole leaks from internal corrosion, tripod assemblies with seized traverse mechanisms, barrel assemblies with erosion exceeding acceptable limits. The weapons that had seemed obsolete now represented critical combat assets, but returning them to service demanded expertise and resources that peacetime budgets hadn't anticipated. Kowalski established a systematic refurbishment process that prioritized weapons with minimal damage for rapid deployment. Teams of armourers worked 12-hour shifts, disassembling each weapon completely and inspecting every component against technical specifications. Water jackets received particular attention. Each was pressure tested to identify leaks, with repairable jackets being re-welded and tested again. Irreparable jackets were cannibalized for other components, with the unusable weapons consigned to scrap metal collection for war industry recycling. The barrel refurbishment proved especially challenging. Browning's original design specifications required barrel bore diameters within 3/10,000ths of an inch tolerance, with rifling grooves maintaining precise depth throughout the barrel's length. 2 decades of storage had caused varying degrees of degradation. Some barrels showed only superficial rust that could be removed with proper cleaning, while others exhibited pitting that had eroded the rifling and compromised accuracy. Kowalski's teams used bore gauges to measure each barrel's condition, setting aside those that failed specifications for potential reboring if manufacturing capacity became available. The tripod assemblies required equally meticulous attention. Each tripod incorporated ball and socket joints that allowed smooth traverse while maintaining rigid support under firing loads. Seized joints needed disassembly, cleaning, and relubrication with modern preservatives superior to the cosmoline applied in 1919. The traverse mechanisms, screw-driven assemblies that allowed fine adjustment of aiming point, frequently showed damaged threads or bent components that required replacement. Kowalski's facility lacked the safe, machine tools to manufacture replacement parts, forcing him to cannibalize damaged weapons to keep others serviceable. Within 2 weeks, Kowalski's facility had restored 280 M1917s to combat-ready condition, shipping them to the West Coast for transport to the Pacific. The refurbishment rate, 20 weapons per day, represented his maximum capacity given available personnel and component supplies. At this pace, returning the entire inventory to service would require 6 months, far too slow for urgent combat requirements. Kowalski requested additional armorer personnel and authorization to contract with civilian machine shops for component manufacturing, beginning a supply chain expansion that would eventually restore over 2,000 weapons to Marine Corps arsenals. The technical re-evaluation went far beyond simple ammunition counts and casualty statistics. Marine engineers conducted detailed thermal analysis of both weapon systems under actual combat conditions, measuring barrel temperatures, and calculating heat dissipation rates in tropical environments. Their findings confirmed what Paige and his gunners had discovered through brutal experience. Air cooling became progressively less effective as ambient temperature and humidity increased. At Guadalcanal's typical 90-degree temperature and 90% humidity, the M1917's cooling capacity dropped by nearly 40% compared to temperate conditions. The reduced temperature differential between hot barrel and surrounding air directly impaired convective heat transfer. Conversely, the M1917's water jacket maintained consistent cooling performance regardless of atmospheric conditions. The system's thermal mass absorbed heat energy continuously and converted it to steam, creating a self-regulating cooling cycle that functioned independently of air temperature or humidity levels. The weight penalty that had made the weapon seem obsolete was actually stored cooling, capacity that paid enormous dividends during sustained engagement. Each pound of water in the cooling jacket could absorb approximately 1 British thermal unit of heat energy per degree Fahrenheit of temperature rise. The full gallon of water weighing approximately 8 pounds provided cooling capacity equivalent to thousands of cubic feet of air circulation. Blake became an unofficial evangelist for the older weapon, briefing newly arrived units on lessons learned from the Matanikau battle. He emphasized that the M1917 required fundamentally different tactics than newer guns. Crews needed to think in terms of sustained fire rather than rapid bursts. Positioning became absolutely critical since the weapon's weight made quick displacement extremely difficult. But properly employed in static defensive roles, it could deliver firepower that lighter weapons simply couldn't match under jungle conditions. The vindication extended beyond individual battles as subsequent engagements confirmed the pattern with brutal consistency. During the October offensive, when General Harukichi Hyakutake committed his 17th Army to a coordinated assault on Henderson Field, M1917 positions again proved decisive. The Japanese threw regiment after regiment against Marine lines, expecting American defenses to buckle under sustained pressure and numerical superiority. Instead, they encountered machine gun fire that never slackened, never paused for extended cooling periods, never created the exploitable gaps that assault troops needed to penetrate defensive positions. The continuous fire capability fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of human wave attacks, transforming them from potentially effective assault methods into suicide missions. Mitchell Paige's performance during the October 25th engagement earned him the Medal of Honor, with citations specifically mentioning his weapon's reliability under extreme conditions. When his position came under overwhelming attack and all supporting guns fell silent due to casualties or mechanical failure, he used the M1917 M1917's sustained fire capability to single-handedly hold a critical section of the perimeter. While lighter weapons would have forced him to pause repeatedly for cooling, the water-cooled gun allowed him to maintain continuous fire even when fighting entirely alone against hundreds of attackers. The logistical implications rippled throughout the Pacific theater as commanders requested M1917S for defensive positions while retaining M1919S for mobile operations. The tactical distribution maximized each weapon's inherent strengths while compensating for their limitations. Heavy guns proved ideal for fixed fortifications, where weight wasn't a disadvantage and sustained fire was paramount. Lighter weapons remained better suited for advancing forces that needed portability over sustained capability. Training protocols evolved rapidly to accommodate the M1917's unique requirements. Gunnery schools emphasized water management, teaching crews to monitor jacket levels and maintain steam vents under combat conditions. Range cards became more critical since the weapon's weight made rapid target acquisition difficult, but its sustained accuracy made careful pre-planning devastatingly effective once firing commenced. Ammunition handling procedures adapted to the longer belt lengths that the water-cooled system could practically accommodate. Blake found himself assigned to develop comprehensive doctrine incorporating lessons learned from Guadalcanal's fighting. The manual he produced emphasized environmental factors that peacetime testing had systematically missed: how humidity affected air cooling efficiency, how sustained fire rates differed fundamentally from cyclic rates, how thermal limitations created tactical vulnerabilities that skilled enemies could exploit. The document became required reading for machine gun crews throughout the Pacific, spreading Guadalcanal's hard-won knowledge to units facing similar conditions across thousands of miles of island warfare. The transformation of perception was perhaps most visible among the Marines themselves. Weapons that had once seemed like punishment details became prized assignments as word spread about their battlefield effectiveness. Veterans of Matanikau and subsequent engagements spoke with genuine reverence about guns that had kept firing when everything else fell silent. The M1917 evolved from museum piece to lifesaver in the span of a few desperate nights, its reputation transformed through combat performance that no amount of peacetime advocacy could have achieved. By December 1942, as Australian forces relieved the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, the tactical lesson had crystallized into formal doctrine. The oldest machine gun in American service had proven superior to its modern replacement under specific conditions, teaching military planners that technological advancement didn't automatically mean tactical improvement. Sometimes the best tool for any given mission was the one that seemed most outdated, its value validated not by specifications on paper, but by performance under fire. The M1917's resurrection represented far more than simple equipment redistribution. It embodied a fundamental shift in how the Marine Corps approached technology adoption for combat operations. Newer wasn't automatically better if it couldn't perform the required mission under actual battlefield conditions. Weight wasn't inherently a disadvantage if it provided essential capabilities that lighter alternatives couldn't match. Complexity wasn't superior to simplicity if environmental factors favored robust reliability over sophisticated features that failed under stress. These lessons would influence American small arms development for decades to come, introducing environmental testing requirements and sustained fire protocols that better predicted actual combat performance. The vindication of an obsolete weapon had taught modern lessons about the relationship between technology and tactics, proving that success came from matching tools to missions rather than assuming that newer designs would automatically provide superior results. The resurrection of the M1917 reached its ultimate expression on Iwo Jima, where the lessons learned at Guadalcanal would face their most demanding test. By February 1945, water-cooled machine guns had become standard equipment for Marine defensive positions throughout the Pacific, their tactical role clearly defined, and their superiority in sustained fire missions universally acknowledged. The Sulphur Islands' black volcanic sand presented challenges that would test every lesson learned over 3 years of island warfare. Captain Blake, now promoted to Major and assigned to coordinate machine gun employment across the 3rd Marine Division, worked with experienced gunners to adapt water-cooled tactics for Iwo Jima's unique terrain. Unlike Guadalcanal's jungle vegetation and coral sand, Iwo Jima offered little natural cover and no fresh water sources for the M1917's cooling system. Japanese defenders had spent months preparing elaborate tunnel networks and reinforced positions that could withstand prolonged bombardment, creating a defensive system where every yard would cost American blood. The absence of natural water sources meant crews would need to carry additional supplies or rely on seawater, requiring modifications to standard operating procedures. Salt water could corrode metal components if left in the cooling jacket for extended periods, necessitating more frequent flushing and cleaning. The volcanic terrain offered excellent fields of fire, but little protection from Japanese artillery that could target stationary positions with devastating accuracy. Paige, now a gunnery sergeant and the Marine Corps' most celebrated machine gunner, provided invaluable expertise during the planning phase. His Medal of Honor citation had made him famous, but combat veterans valued his practical knowledge about M1917 employment under extreme conditions. He identified positions where the weapon's sustained fire capability could dominate key terrain features, particularly around the approaches to Mount Suribachi and the airfield runways that were the invasion's primary objectives. The landing on February 19th demonstrated how completely the Corps had embraced the water-cooled weapon's tactical role. M1917s came ashore in the initial waves, their crews trained specifically in rapid emplacement techniques that could establish defensive positions within minutes of landing. The gun's sustained fire capability became critical as Japanese defenders emerged from concealed positions to contest every meter of beach landing sites. The fighting that followed validated every lesson learned since Guadalcanal. Japanese tactics on Iwo Jima relied heavily on nighttime infiltration and sudden assaults from concealed positions, exactly the engagement type where continuous firepower proved decisive. The M1917 positions maintained defensive integrity through repeated counterattacks that would have overwhelmed lighter weapons forced into cooling cycles. Private Tommy Sullivan, assigned to an M1917 crew in the 28th Marines, experienced the weapon's capabilities during the brutal fighting for the base of Mount Suribachi. His position came under attack on the 3rd night ashore, when approximately 200 Japanese soldiers emerged from cave systems to assault the American perimeter. Sullivan's gun fired continuously for 40 minutes, consuming over 2,000 rounds, while maintaining the steady 600-round-per-minute pace that had become the weapon's signature. The water jacket temperature rose steadily throughout the engagement, steam venting in visible clouds that marked the gun's position for enemy observers. But the cooling system never approached failure, maintaining barrel temperature within safe operational limits while the mechanism functioned flawlessly. Adjacent positions equipped with M1919s experienced the familiar pattern. Impressive initial fire rates, followed by forced cooling periods that created gaps in defensive coverage. Sullivan's M1917 filled those gaps, its sustained capability providing the continuous fire that held the perimeter until dawn. Blake observed the battle from division headquarters, monitoring radio reports and casualty figures that confirmed what Guadalcanal had taught. M1917 positions were maintaining average uptimes of 96% during sustained engagements, compared to 72% for air-cooled weapons in similar conditions. The difference translated to thousands of rounds that reached their targets instead of waiting in overheated chambers, firepower that proved decisive in breaking Japanese assaults. The psychological impact of the weapon had become as important as its physical effects during the prolonged fighting. Japanese defenders had learned to distinguish the M1917's distinctive firing signature from other American weapons, recognizing its sound as indicating a position that could maintain fire indefinitely. The gun's ability to sustain barrage for hours without pause forced enemy units to remain in concealment rather than attempting movement, limiting their tactical flexibility and reducing their ability to coordinate effective counterattacks. The technical innovations, sparked by the weapon's renaissance, continued evolving throughout the campaign. Ordnance specialists had developed improved water circulation systems that increased cooling efficiency by 15%, allowing even higher sustained fire rates without overheating. Ammunition feeding mechanisms had been refined to handle belt lengths exceeding 1,000 rounds, reducing reload frequency during critical engagements. Optical sights had been upgraded to exploit the weapon's inherent accuracy at extended ranges. But the most important changes remained tactical rather than technical. Marine Corps doctrine now recognized the M1917 as a specialized tool, optimized for specific missions, rather than a general-purpose weapon trying to excel at everything. Fixed defensive positions, sustained suppressive fire, and precision engagement at extended ranges had become its acknowledged specialties. This tactical clarity eliminated the confusion that had initially surrounded the weapon's employment, allowing commanders to deploy it where its unique capabilities provided maximum advantage. The human cost of this tactical education had been enormous. Veterans like Paige had risked their lives developing the expertise that made effective employment possible. Countless machine gun crews had learned through trial and error, their mistakes measured in casualties rather than training scores. The knowledge had been purchased with blood and validated through survival, creating a body of tactical wisdom that no peacetime exercise could have generated. Blake's after-action reports from Iwo Jima would become the foundation for post-war machine gun doctrine, codifying lessons learned through 3 years of Pacific combat. His analysis emphasized environmental factors that had been largely ignored in pre-war planning: how humidity affected cooling efficiency, how sustained fire requirements differed from burst fire capabilities, how thermal limitations created tactical vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The document would influence American small arms development for decades, establishing testing protocols and design requirements that better predicted actual combat performance. The broader implications extended beyond individual weapon systems to fundamental questions about military innovation and technology adoption. The M1917's success had demonstrated that newer wasn't automatically better, that battlefield requirements often differed from laboratory specifications, and that combat veterans' experience provided insights that theoretical analysis couldn't replicate. These lessons would reshape how the military evaluated new equipment, emphasizing proven performance over promised capabilities. As the Pacific War drew toward its conclusion with Japan's surrender in August 1945, the M1917 found itself in an unusual position. An obsolete weapon that had proven superior to its modern replacement under specific conditions. The tactical niche it had carved out during the jungle fighting at Guadalcanal had expanded throughout the island-hopping campaign, providing capabilities that lighter weapons simply couldn't match when missions demanded sustained firepower over extended periods. The weapon's influence on post-war planning became apparent as military planners prepared for potential conflicts in other environments. Present different challenges than Pacific Islands, but the lessons learned about environmental factors and sustained operations would prove relevant in unexpected ways. The M1917 would see limited service in Korea, gradually replaced by updated designs that incorporated its cooling principles with more modern materials and manufacturing techniques. The final irony was perhaps most profound. John Moses Browning's design philosophy, emphasizing reliability and sustainability over theoretical performance, had proven more relevant in 1945 than in 1917 when the gun first entered production. The intervening decades had taught the military to value complexity and sophistication, pursuing ever higher performance specifications. But combat had revealed the enduring importance of fundamental engineering principles that prioritized function over fashion, reliability over raw specifications. Blake's final entry in his personal operational log captured the essence of what the M1917 had taught him and the entire Marine Corps. The weapon had succeeded not by excelling at everything, but by being uniquely suited to specific missions that proved critical to victory. Its renaissance had demonstrated that military effectiveness came from matching tools to tasks, rather than assuming that newer technology would automatically provide superior results, regardless of mission requirements or environmental conditions. The lesson extended far beyond machine guns, to encompass the entire relationship between technology and tactics in modern warfare. The M1917's vindication had shown that combat would always be the final arbiter of military effectiveness, that battlefield requirements often contradicted peacetime assumptions, and that the most important innovation sometimes involved rediscovering old solutions rather than developing new ones simply for the sake of novelty. In a war defined by rapid technological advancement from radar to nuclear weapons, obsolete machine gun had taught the most modern lesson of all. Success came from understanding what actually worked rather than what theoretically should work. The water-cooled Browning had saved countless Marine lives by performing its designed mission flawlessly when survival depended on sustained fire under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The M1917 service record stood as testament to engineering principles that transcended technological fashion. Its water-cooled system, considered obsolete by peacetime planners, had proven essential under tropical conditions where air cooling failed catastrophically. Its weight, viewed as a liability during mobile operations, provided the thermal mass necessary for sustained fire during defensive engagements. Its complexity, seemingly a disadvantage compared to simpler designs, enabled reliability that saved lives when mechanical failure meant death. Sergeant Paige would survive the war, his reputation as the Marine Corps' premier machine gunner forever linked to the weapon that had validated his expertise. He would spend years after the war teaching new generations of Marines about sustained fire principles and the importance of matching weapons to missions. His Medal of Honor citation would specifically mention the M1917, ensuring the weapon's combat record remained part of Marine Corps tradition. Captain Blake would eventually retire as a colonel, his career defined by the night he watched an obsolete weapon outperform its modern replacement and learned that tactical effectiveness couldn't be determined by specifications alone. He would write extensively about the experience, contributing to military journals and teaching at staff colleges, where officers learned that successful innovation sometimes meant recognizing old truths rather than pursuing new theories. The M1917 Browning water-cooled machine gun would gradually disappear from American arsenals as post-war designs incorporated improved cooling systems and lighter materials. But its legacy would endure in the doctrine it had shaped, the Marines it had saved, and the fundamental lesson it had taught about the relationship between technology and combat effectiveness. Sometimes the forgotten relic of an earlier war held the key to victory in a modern one not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectly suited to the mission that mattered most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.